Medieval Myths Debunked. What history really says. So, you think the Middle Ages were just dirt, disease, and despair? Where rats chewed your bread, your teeth fell out by 30, and you never touched a bar of soap? Let's bust some of the most persistent and frankly lazy myths about medieval life. Myth number 1. Everyone thought the Earth was flat. This myth is one of the most persistent and misleading. In reality, educated people in the Middle Ages, especially scholars in Europe and the Islamic world, knew the Earth was spherical. This knowledge was inherited from ancient Greek thinkers like Pythagoras and Aristotle, and further refined by medieval scholars such as Thomas Aquinas and Islamic polymath al-Biruni, who calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy. The flat Earth myth gained traction in the 19th century, particularly through Washington Irving's fictionalized biography of Columbus. It served as a convenient way to paint the medieval period as ignorant and backward, contrasting it with the enlightened modern age, but it's a historical distortion, not fact. Myth number 2. Everyone drank beer because water was unsafe. While beer and ale were common, especially in urban areas, they weren't the only sources of hydration. People in rural areas drank from wells, springs, and rivers they knew to be clean. Boiling water for cooking and brewing helped reduce contamination, but the idea that water was universally unsafe is an exaggeration. Monasteries and towns often maintained clean water sources, and people were aware of the dangers of foul water. Ale was often weak, this was called small beer, and consumed for calories as much as hydration. Children might drink it, but not exclusively, and not in the quantities modern myths suggest. The notion that medieval people were perpetually tipsy is more of a punchline than a historical reality. Myth number 3. People never bathed and were always filthy. Bathing was a regular part of life for many medieval people. Public bathhouses were common in towns across Europe, especially in the early and high Middle Ages. Monasteries had rules for regular bathing, and wealthier households had private tubs. Even peasants washed in rivers or with basins. Cleanliness was associated with health and piety, and scented herbs were used to freshen clothes and bodies. The myth of the filthy medieval peasant likely stems from later periods, especially the 17th and 18th centuries, when public bathing fell out of favor due to fears of disease. Ironically, the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods were often less hygienic than the Middle Ages. Myth number 4. Medieval food was rancid, bland, and made with sawdust. Medieval cuisine was surprisingly diverse and flavorful. Spices like cinnamon, cloves, and saffron were prized and widely used, especially among the wealthy. Even peasants had access to herbs like parsley, sage, and garlic. Bread, cheese, legumes, and seasonal vegetables formed the backbone of the diet. Preservation methods like salting, smoking, and pickling were common and effective. The idea that food was made with sawdust or was always spoiled is a modern projection. People were deeply invested in food preparation and safety because their survival depended on it. Recipes from medieval cookbooks show a sophisticated understanding of flavor and nutrition. Myth number 5. Everyone wore ragged, filthy clothes. Clothing was a valuable asset, and people took care of it. Even peasants mended garments, washed linens, and passed down clothing through generations. Wool and linen were the most common fabrics, and people used natural dyes to add color. Wealthier individuals wore elaborate garments, but even the poor had standards of cleanliness and repair. Laundry was labor-intensive, but it was done. Undergarments were washed frequently, and outer garments were brushed and aired. The idea that everyone looked like a plague-ridden extra from a zombie movie is pure fiction. Myth number 6. Medieval women had no property rights and lived in seclusion. Medieval women's legal and economic status was far more nuanced than complete dependency. In many parts of Europe, women, noble and common alike, could inherit land, manage dowries, and litigate in courts. For instance, in 13th century Castile, women retained ownership of their dowry and could divorce under certain conditions. Even peasant women often controlled the family garden, livestock, and profits from spinning and brewing. Outside the household, elite women wielded political and diplomatic power as regents, landholders, and patrons of learning or religious orders. Queens like Berenguela of Castile or Blanche of Castile in France ruled in their own right and negotiated treaties. To dismiss all medieval women as powerless erases centuries of documented female agency in law, commerce, and governance. Myth number 7. Medieval medicine was purely superstition and always harmful. While bloodletting and charms existed, medieval practitioners also built upon a rich legacy of Galen, Hippocrates, and Islamic scholars. Hospitals run by religious orders cared for the sick. Surgeons performed cataract removals and trepanations with surprising success rates for the era. Monastic infirmaries recorded recipes, like Bald's Leech Book eye salve, that modern tests show have genuine antimicrobial properties. Medical knowledge traveled between cultures. Ibn Sina's canon of medicine guided European universities until the 17th century, and Jewish physician Maimonides wrote treatises blending empirical observation with ethical practice. Peasant remedies combined plants with dosage guidelines passed down in households. To call medieval medicine wholly quattery overlooks a centuries-long evolution toward more systematic, if still rudimentary, healthcare. Myth number 8. All medieval jobs were smelly, menial, and carried zero status. Sure, some occupations, like cesspit emptying or tannery work, smelled bad, but they were indispensable and often well compensated. Gong farmers, or cesspit cleaners in Tudor England, earned wages on par with skilled artisans because they protected public health. Rat catchers could command high fees during plague outbreaks. Their role was vital to controlling disease. Meanwhile, specialized trades like coopers, millers, and weavers formed powerful guilds that regulated quality and training. Even unusual jobs carried prestige. Falconers served nobility, bird trainers managed exotic menageries, and heralds delivered royal messages. Cities showcased these roles in annual fairs, where the best craftsmen and oddities, like peacock trainers or public executioners, drew crowds. To label all medieval work as lowly ignores a sophisticated labor market with nuanced social hierarchies. Myth number 9. Medieval Islamic and Byzantine cities were as filthy as European slums. Medieval Islamic and Eastern Roman Byzantine cities developed advanced sanitation long before many European counterparts. Cairo's hospital water system, Damascus's public fountains, and Baghdad's underground aqueducts, or qanats, delivered fresh water to markets and mosques. In Constantinople, imperial edicts kept streets clean, and public latrines channeled waste into the sea or rivers. Scholars like Ibn al-Munajjim described regular street sweeping and social norms against spillage. Bathhouses in these cities were centers of community life, hygiene, and medicine, far from the filthy slums stereotype. The cross-cultural exchange of engineering and public health practices shows that medieval urban cleanliness varied widely by region, not by a simple east-west or north-south divide. Myth number 10. Medieval bestiaries were taken as literal zoology. Medieval bestiaries, those lavishly illustrated manuscripts, were primarily moral and allegorical texts, not field guides. Monks and clerics compiled stories of creatures like the manticore or the monoceros from earlier sources like Pliny and Physiologus, but they framed each beast as a spiritual lesson. A unicorn's horn symbolized purity. The basilisk's deadly gaze warned against pride. Educated readers recognized the moral overlay and didn't expect to spot horned horses shooting quill-like thorns in their village. By contrast, real animals were described in separate works by naturalists such as Albertus Magnus, who distinguished observable zoology from legendary lore. When travelers brought back odd specimens, narwhal tusks, passed off as unicorn horns, scholars debated authenticity. Bestiaries thrived as devotional art and didactic tools, not as medieval Pokédexes. Myth number 11. Medieval Europe was uniformly Christian and suppressed all other beliefs. Although the Church dominated official life, popular religion was far more pluralistic. Peasants routinely blended Christian rites with local folk beliefs. Veneration of springs, forest spirits, and fairies persisted well into the 14th century. Town records occasionally penalized charms or pagan rituals, showing that such practices were common enough to worry clerics. Meanwhile, Jewish communities thrived in many regions until expulsions began in the late Middle Ages, and in Iberia, Muslims, or Mudejars, maintained mosques and schools under Christian rule. Heretical movements, Cathars, Waldensians, Lollards, demonstrate that medieval Europe wasn't monolithic. These groups organized their own congregations, produced vernacular scriptures, and contested church doctrines years before the Reformation. Far from a uniform Dark Ages of blind orthodoxy, the period saw vigorous religious debate and accommodation. Myth number 12. Knights couldn't mount horses without cranes and fought only one-on-one duels. Full plate armor by the late 15th century weighed around 20 to 25 kilograms, surprisingly well-balanced and jointed. Knights learned to don it independently or with minimal assistance. Period manuals show techniques for mounting with stirrups and quirts. Crane-assisted mounting appears in a few accounts, but it was a novelty, not standard practice. Moreover, sunlight on harness rivets and heat exhaustion posed greater challenges than sheer weight. In battle, knightly engagement was a blend of shock cavalry, archery support, and infantry maneuvers. Chroniclers describe massed charges, feigned retreats, and formation tactics at Crécy and Agincourt. Individual jousts and judicial combats existed but were legal spectacles or tournament sport, not everyday warfare. Feudal lords prioritized logistics, supply lines, and combined arms well before gunpowder reshaped battlefields. Myth number 13. The Dark Ages meant universal illiteracy and no schools. Literacy in the early Middle Ages was limited but never extinct. Monastic scriptoria in Ireland, Carolingian Francia, and Anglo-Saxon England produced and copied thousands of manuscripts. From the 11th century onward, cathedral schools and emerging universities at Bologna, Paris, and Oxford admitted lay students. Town guilds sometimes sponsored reading circles. Merchants and notaries needed literacy to manage contracts, tolls, and accounts. Vernacular literature flourished. Old English epics, Occitan troubadour poetry, and Middle-High German romances reached broad audiences. Even peasants gained practical skills, basic arithmetic, reckoning, and letter reading through apprenticeships or parish priests. Far from a millennium without learning, Europe saw a gradual expansion of educational institutions and a revival of classical texts under Carolingian Renaissance auspices. Myth number 14. Medieval people never practiced hygiene and just dumped waste into the streets. It's true medieval sanitation looks primitive by modern standards, but the idea that no one washed and everyone flung chamber pot refuse willy-nilly into the street is a caricature. Washing hands before meals was regarded as good etiquette in both noble and urban households. Basins filled from wells, springs, or cisterns allowed regular hand and face washing. Wealthier homes and monasteries even had piped water or settling tanks to improve quality. Public bathhouses flourished through the 13th century, and personal hygiene was linked not only to health but to piety and social standing. Street dumping of waste was legally regulated, not celebrated. Town councils in York, Coventry, and London imposed fines on residents who failed to clean the frontage of their property or who dumped refuse into lanes or rivers. Larger houses and public buildings had enclosed latrines draining into cesspits. Gong farmers were paid handsomely to remove and repurpose that material, often as fertilizer. While some chamber pots were emptied at night into streams or ditches, the ritual cry of "Gardaloo" warned passers-by, hardly the image of heedless filth described by mythmongers. Myth number 15. Everyone lived in a perpetual shower of fleas, lice, and intestinal worms. Parasites were indeed a health nuisance, but they weren't a constant, universal affliction. Archaeological studies show that roughly a quarter to a third of medieval burials yield helminth eggs, roundworm and whipworm, with significant variation by region, diet, and sanitation practices. Monks in Cambridge had higher rates, possibly because they fertilized gardens with human waste, but many lay people escaped heavy infection thanks to hand-washing, periodic delousing, and crop rotations that broke parasite life cycles. As for lice and fleas, medieval combs with narrow teeth and specialized fumigation ointments, often containing mercury or aromatic herbs, attest to deliberate anti-parasite efforts. Municipal ordinances sometimes forbidden straw bedding in inns to reduce vermin. Tanning houses and textile workshops used smoke to drive off pests. Treatises from Hippocratic and Arabic medical traditions recommended purging, poultices, and cleaning rituals to control both external and internal parasites, hardly the picture of passive resignation painted by modern myths. History deserves better than memes and myths. The Middle Ages weren't a golden utopia, but they weren't a barbaric toilet either. So next time someone brings up the Dark Ages, ask which part: the stained glass, the university system, or the hundreds of saints' feast days. Thanks for watching, and stay curious.